So, here's something worth thinking about as you settle in tonight. Right now, as you're lying there, wherever you are in the world, there are about 440 nuclear reactors humming away in over 30 countries. They're generating something like 10% of all the electricity on Earth. Most of them are doing it quietly, safely, without anyone giving them a second thought. And that's kind of the point. When nuclear power works the way it's supposed to, it's invisible. It's just electricity. It's your lights turning on, your phone charging, your refrigerator keeping things cold. You don't think about where it comes from. But every now and then, something goes wrong. And when something goes wrong with a nuclear reactor, it goes wrong in a way that captures the entire world's attention. These are the moments that reshape policy, redirect the course of entire industries, change the way engineers think about safety for generations. And what's fascinating, what I find endlessly fascinating, is that when you actually look at what happened in each of these disasters, the causes are almost never what you'd expect. They're not stories about technology failing in some mysterious, incomprehensible way. They're stories about people, about decisions, about assumptions that seemed perfectly reasonable at the time, about warning signs that were there, clearly there, but got ignored or misunderstood or buried under bureaucracy. So tonight, we're going to walk through them, slowly, one by one. We'll talk about what actually happened inside those reactors, what the physics was doing, what the engineers knew and didn't know, and why each disaster changed the world in ways that are still with us today. And along the way, I think you'll start to see something surprising, that the history of nuclear accidents is really a history of how humans learn, how we get better at managing forces that are almost unimaginably powerful. It's a story about humility, in a way, about what happens when our confidence outruns our understanding. But before we get to any of the famous disasters, we need to go back to the beginning, because you can't really understand what goes wrong in a nuclear reactor unless you understand what's supposed to go right. And the story of how we figured that out, how we went from barely understanding the atom to splitting it and harnessing its energy, that story is one of the great adventures of the 20th century. Let's start with the atom itself. For most of human history, the atom was a philosophical idea, not a scientific one. The ancient Greeks had this notion that if you kept cutting matter into smaller and smaller pieces, eventually you'd reach something indivisible. Atomos, they called it. Uncuttable. And for about 2,000 years, that's roughly where things stood. It wasn't until the late 1800s that scientists started to realize atoms weren't indivisible at all. They had structure, they had parts, and those parts behaved in ways nobody expected. In 1896, a French physicist named Henri Becquerel discovered something strange. He'd been working with uranium salts, and he noticed they were giving off some kind of invisible radiation all on their own, without any external energy source. Nobody understood why. Marie Curie and her husband Pierre picked up that thread and ran with it, discovering new radioactive elements, coining the very word radioactivity. And here's the thing that's easy to forget. At this point, nobody had any idea what was causing it. They knew atoms were doing something, emitting energy somehow, but the mechanism was a complete mystery. Then in 1911, Ernest Rutherford figured out that atoms had a nucleus, a tiny, incredibly dense core where almost all the mass was concentrated. And once you knew that, the next question was obvious. What's holding that nucleus together? Because think about it. The nucleus of an atom is made up of protons and neutrons. Protons are positively charged, and positive charges repel each other. So what's keeping them from flying apart? There had to be some force, some incredibly strong force, holding the nucleus together despite all that electrical repulsion. And there is, we call it the strong nuclear force, and it's the most powerful force in nature. But it only works over absurdly tiny distances, like the width of a nucleus itself. Now here's where it gets interesting for our story. If you can break that nucleus apart, if you can split it, you release some of that binding energy. And the amount of energy is honestly hard to wrap your mind around. Einstein had already shown, with his famous equation E equals mc squared, that mass and energy are the same thing. A tiny amount of mass converts to an enormous amount of energy. And when a heavy atom like uranium splits, the pieces that result weigh very slightly less than the original atom. That missing mass has been converted to energy. We're talking about a difference so small you'd need incredibly precise instruments to measure it. But the energy it represents is millions of times greater than what you'd get from a chemical reaction, burning coal, say, or detonating TNT. The person who figured out that atoms could actually be split was, again, connected to Rutherford's lab. In 1932, James Chadwick discovered the neutron, an uncharged particle in the nucleus. And that discovery was the key that unlocked everything, because neutrons, being electrically neutral, could slip past all the electrical defenses of an atom and penetrate the nucleus directly. You couldn't do that with a proton. It would be repelled by the positive charge of the nucleus long before it got close enough. But a neutron could just drift right in. By the late 1930s, physicists in several countries were firing neutrons at uranium atoms and getting confusing results. In Berlin, in December 1938, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann bombarded uranium with neutrons and found barium in the aftermath. Barium, an element with roughly half the atomic weight of uranium. That made no sense. You don't get barium from uranium by chipping off a small piece. Something much more dramatic had happened. The uranium atom had split roughly in half. It was Lise Meitner, an Austrian-Swedish physicist who had been Hahn's longtime collaborator, but had been forced to flee Nazi Germany because of her Jewish heritage, who provided the theoretical explanation. Working with her nephew Otto Frisch over Christmas vacation in Sweden, she calculated the energy that would be released and realized it matched Einstein's equation perfectly. Frisch coined the term fission, borrowing from biology, the way a cell divides, nuclear fission. And when Meitner and Frisch published their explanation in January 1939, the physics community immediately understood the implications, not just for science, for everything. Because here's the crucial detail. When a uranium-235 atom absorbs a neutron and splits, it doesn't just release energy, it also releases more neutrons, typically 2 or 3 of them. And each of those neutrons can go on to split another uranium atom, which releases more neutrons, which split more atoms. A chain reaction. If you can sustain that chain reaction in a controlled way, you have a source of energy. If you let it run away uncontrolled, you have a bomb. And this is December 1938, January 1939. Europe is on the brink of war. The implications are terrifying. Leo Szilard, a Hungarian physicist who had actually predicted the possibility of a chain reaction years earlier, was so alarmed that he convinced Einstein to write a letter to President Roosevelt warning that Germany might develop an atomic weapon. That letter, sent in August 1939, eventually led to the Manhattan Project. But that's a story you probably know. What matters for us tonight is the other path, the controlled chain reaction. because that's the path that leads to nuclear power and eventually to the disasters we're going to talk about. The first person to achieve a controlled, self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction was Enrico Fermi, and he did it in one of the most unlikely settings imaginable. It was December 2nd, 1942, underneath the stands of a squash court at the University of Chicago. Stagg Field. Fermi and his team had built what they called an atomic pile, layers of uranium and graphite blocks, stacked up in a rough sphere about 25 feet across. The graphite served as a moderator. It slowed down the neutrons. See, fast neutrons, the kind that come flying out of a fission reaction, are actually not very good at causing more fission in uranium-235. They're moving too fast. They just zip right through. But if you slow them down, moderate them, they become much more likely to be absorbed by another uranium-235 nucleus and cause it to split. The graphite did that. It was like putting speed bumps on a highway so the neutrons would linger long enough to interact. And to control the reaction, Fermi used cadmium rods. Cadmium is a neutron absorber. It soaks up neutrons like a sponge. Push the cadmium rods into the pile, and they absorb enough neutrons to stop the chain reaction. Pull them out, and the reaction speeds up. It's beautifully simple in concept. The entire principle of controlling a nuclear reactor, even today, comes down to this basic idea. You manage the population of neutrons. More neutrons, more fission, more heat. Fewer neutrons, less fission, less heat. Every reactor ever built is essentially a machine for managing neutrons. On that December afternoon, Fermi's team slowly withdrew the cadmium control rods, one step at a time, monitoring the neutron count with instruments, and at 3:25 in the afternoon, the neutron count started rising steadily and didn't stop. The reaction was self-sustaining. Fermi let it run for about 28 minutes, then ordered the control rods reinserted. The whole thing produced about half a watt of power, barely enough to light a small flashlight bulb. But it proved the principle. You could split atoms in a controlled way. You could start the reaction, manage it, and stop it. Now, what Fermi built under that squash court was not a power reactor. It produced almost no useful energy, and it had essentially no safety systems. There was no containment structure, no cooling system, no radiation shielding to speak of. If something had gone wrong, if the reaction had run away faster than the control rods could be reinserted, well, it was sitting underneath a football stadium in the middle of Chicago. The backup safety plan was literally a guy standing on top of the pile with a bucket of cadmium solution, ready to pour it over everything. They called him the Suicide Squad. I'm not making that up. That was the actual term they used. And this tells you something important about the early days of nuclear science. The people involved were brilliant. Fermi was one of the greatest physicists who ever lived. But the safety culture was, by modern standards, almost non-existent. They were inventing something entirely new, and they were doing it in the middle of a world war, under enormous time pressure. Safety was a concern, but it was weighed against urgency. And that tension, between the desire to push forward and the need to be careful, that tension runs through the entire history of nuclear energy like a fault line. Every disaster we're going to talk about tonight, in one way or another, traces back to some version of that tension. After the war, the question became, what do you do with this technology now? The bombs had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The world had seen what uncontrolled fission could do. But controlled fission, that was something else entirely. That was potentially the greatest energy source humanity had ever discovered, A single pound of uranium-235, fully fissioned, releases as much energy as burning about 3 million pounds of coal. Think about that. 3 million to 1. No smoke, no carbon dioxide, no trainloads of fuel arriving every day. Just this dense, quiet, almost magical source of heat. The challenge was turning that heat into electricity. And the basic concept is, honestly, kind of anticlimactic when you first hear it. A nuclear power plant is, at its heart, a very expensive way to boil water. That's it. The nuclear reaction generates heat. The heat boils water. The steam turns a turbine. The turbine spins a generator. Electricity comes out. The nuclear part is just the heat source. Everything downstream of that, the steam, the turbine, the generator, is the same technology that's been used in coal plants and gas plants for over a century. James Watt would recognize the basic principle. But the nuclear part, the reactor, that's where all the complexity lives. Because you're managing a chain reaction that, if it gets out of control, doesn't just burn hotter like a coal fire. It can escalate exponentially. The neutron population can double in fractions of a second. And the materials involved are radioactive, meaning they emit radiation that's invisible, odorless, and can be lethal. You can't see it, you can't smell it, you can't feel it until the damage is already done. So the engineering challenge is immense. Contain the reaction, control the reaction, cool the fuel, shield the workers, and have backup systems for your backup systems. The first reactor to actually generate usable electricity was EBR-1, Experimental Breeder Reactor 1, at a remote site in Idaho on December 20th, 1951. It lit up 4 light bulbs powered by nuclear fission. The scientists there reportedly wrote on the wall of the generator room, "Electricity was first generated here from atomic energy." And then, just a few years later, the world's first commercial nuclear power plant opened, Calder Hall in England in 1956. The Soviet Union had actually connected a small reactor to the grid in 1954 at Obninsk, producing about 5 megawatts. But Calder Hall was larger, more ambitious, a real power station. And here's where the story starts to branch in ways that matter enormously for what comes later. Because different countries, different engineers, different institutions all made different choices about how to build their reactors. The Americans favored light water reactors, using ordinary water as both the coolant and the moderator. The British went with gas-cooled, graphite-moderated designs. The Canadians developed heavy water reactors. The Soviets built a design called the RBMK, a graphite-moderated, water-cooled reactor that was large, powerful, and relatively cheap to build. Each of these designs had different strengths, different weaknesses, and critically, different failure modes. The way a light water reactor fails is fundamentally different from the way a graphite-moderated reactor fails. And understanding those differences is going to be essential when we get to the specific disasters. But there's something else happening in this early period that's just as important as the reactor designs themselves, and that's the development, or in some cases, the lack of development, of safety culture. In the United States, the Atomic Energy Commission was responsible for both promoting nuclear power and regulating it. Think about that conflict of interest for a moment. The same agency that wanted nuclear power to succeed was also the one deciding whether plants were safe enough to operate. And in the Soviet Union, the nuclear program was wrapped up in military secrecy and national pride in ways that made honest safety assessments almost impossible. Admitting a problem meant admitting the system had a flaw, and the system wasn't supposed to have flaws. So, by the late 1950s and into the 1960s, You have this incredible situation. Nuclear reactors are being built and operated around the world, generating real electricity for real cities, and the fundamental safety philosophy is still being invented on the fly. Engineers are learning as they go, and some of the lessons they're about to learn are going to come at a terrible cost. The first serious nuclear accident that really shook people, the one that made the world realize these machines could bite back, happened not at a power plant, but at a military reactor in the high desert of Idaho. It was January 3rd, 1961, and the reactor was called SL-1, which stood for Stationary Low Power Reactor Number 1. It was a small, almost experimental Army reactor designed to provide power and heat to remote military installations, the kind of thing you could set up at an Arctic radar station. It produced only about 3 megawatts of thermal power, tiny by nuclear standards. And on that winter night, 3 young military operators were performing routine maintenance, preparing the reactor for a restart after a holiday shutdown. What they were supposed to do was manually reconnect the control rod drives. What happened instead was something no one fully anticipated. One of the operators, a young Army specialist named Richard Legg, just 26 years old, withdrew the central control rod far too quickly and far too far. Instead of lifting it the 4 inches required to reconnect the drive mechanism, the rod came out about 20 inches in a single rapid motion, and 20 inches was enough. In a reactor that small, with that particular core design, pulling the central control rod out 20 inches introduced so much reactivity so fast that the reactor went from essentially shut down to prompt critical in about 4 milliseconds, 4 thousandths of a second. That's not a gradual power increase. That's not something you can respond to. That's a nuclear excursion, a burst of energy so sudden and so intense that the water surrounding the fuel flashed instantly to steam, and the resulting steam explosion was violent enough to launch the entire reactor vessel 9 feet into the air. The pressure spike sent a column of water and debris straight up with enough force to pin one of the operators to the ceiling of the reactor building by the control rod that impaled him. All 3 men were killed. 2 died almost instantly from the physical violence of the explosion. The 3rd survived initially, but died within hours from his injuries and massive radiation exposure. And here's the thing that made SL-1 so haunting for the people who had to deal with the aftermath. The bodies were so radioactive that rescue workers could only approach them for seconds at a time. It took days to recover all 3 men from the reactor building. The radiation fields were just staggering. One of the bodies wasn't removed for nearly 3 weeks. When they were finally buried, the men were interred in lead-lined caskets, and certain body parts that were too radioactive to handle were treated as nuclear waste. Think about what that means. Not just for the engineering community, but for the families, for the other soldiers on that base, for the whole idea that nuclear technology was something safe and manageable. Now, the investigation that followed raised questions that have never been fully answered. Why did that control rod come out so far, so fast? Was it stuck and the operator yanked on it? Was it a deliberate act? There were rumors, and they remain rumors, debated by historians to this day, about personal troubles among the 3-man crew, about a possible murder-suicide. The official investigation couldn't conclusively determine the cause, though it noted that the rod could have been stuck due to corrosion and boron deposits, and that a sharp pull could have freed it all at once. The human story behind SL-1 is murky and sad in ways that go beyond the engineering. But what was crystal clear from an engineering standpoint was that the reactor's design had a fatal flaw. It could be made to go prompt critical by the withdrawal of a single control rod. That should never be possible. A well-designed reactor should be built so that no single operator error, no single mechanical failure can cause a catastrophic excursion. And SL-1 didn't meet that standard. After the accident, this became a foundational principle in reactor safety. The idea that you design the system so that one mistake, no matter how bad, cannot produce the worst-case outcome. You need multiple failures, multiple barriers, multiple things going wrong simultaneously. This concept would later be formalized as defense in depth, and it's one of the most important ideas in all of nuclear engineering. But in 1961, it was a lesson learned in blood. SL-1 was a military reactor, small and somewhat obscure, and the accident didn't get the kind of public attention that later events would. But within the nuclear community, it sent a chill. It was the first time American reactor personnel had been killed by a nuclear accident, and it forced a reckoning with the question of how much you could trust human operators, especially in situations where the margin for error was razor thin. And that question, how much do you trust the human in the loop, is going to come back again and again in this story. It's almost the central question of nuclear safety, because reactors are designed by humans, built by humans, operated by humans, and regulated by humans. And humans get tired and distracted and overconfident, and they cut corners, and they misread instruments, and sometimes they just make honest mistakes at the worst possible moment. So let's step back from Idaho and look at what was happening across the Atlantic. Because while the Americans were grappling with SL-1, the British had already had their own nuclear fire, literally, a few years earlier. And the story of Windscale is one of those tales that's almost hard to believe, because so many things went wrong in such a specific sequence that you'd think someone was making it up. The Windscale facility sat on the coast of northwest England, in what's now called Sellafield. It was home to two air-cooled, graphite-moderated reactors, Pile Number 1 and Pile Number 2, and their primary purpose wasn't generating electricity. They were plutonium production reactors built to supply material for Britain's nuclear weapons program. This was the early 1950s. The Cold War was intensifying, and Britain was desperate to establish itself as a nuclear power independent of the Americans. The urgency was enormous. Now, these reactors used graphite as a moderator, and graphite has a peculiar property that the physicists of the era were still getting to grips with. When graphite is bombarded by neutrons over time, the carbon atoms get knocked out of their normal crystal lattice positions and lodge in irregular spots. This stores energy in the graphite. It's called Wigner energy, named after the physicist Eugene Wigner who predicted it. And the thing about Wigner energy is that it accumulates. The graphite just keeps absorbing this energy, storing it like a compressed spring. And if it's not periodically released in a controlled way, it can release all at once, spontaneously, and the graphite can get dangerously hot. The way you release Wigner energy safely is through a process called annealing. You deliberately heat the graphite to a temperature where the displaced atoms can migrate back to their proper positions, releasing the stored energy gradually. The Windscale operators did this periodically. It was a known maintenance procedure. But here's what's really important to understand. Annealing was not a precise science at this point. They were still figuring out the exact temperatures needed, the exact procedures, the exact risks. It was, like so much of early nuclear engineering, a process of educated guesswork refined by experience. On October 10, 1957, the operators of Windscale Pile Number 1 began an annealing cycle. They reduced reactor power, then raised it again in a specific pattern designed to heat the graphite evenly. But the first heating cycle didn't seem to release enough Wigner energy. The temperature readings weren't showing the expected rise and fall pattern that would indicate the energy was being released. So they decided to do a second nuclear heating. They pushed more power into the reactor to try to get the graphite hotter. And this is where things started to go very wrong. What the operators didn't fully appreciate was that the thermocouples, the temperature sensors embedded in the reactor, were not located in the hottest parts of the graphite. They were getting readings that suggested the graphite wasn't hot enough, but in reality, certain regions of the core were already much hotter than anyone realized. When they pushed more power in, those already hot regions got hotter still. And at some point, the temperature in parts of the core exceeded the ignition point of the uranium fuel cartridges. The fuel caught fire inside the reactor. And because Windscale was an air-cooled design, meaning actual air was blown through the core and exhausted out of a tall chimney stack, the fire had a steady supply of oxygen. It was, in a very real sense, a nuclear-fueled chimney fire. The burning uranium released radioactive contamination directly into the airstream flowing through the reactor and out into the atmosphere. For about 16 hours, the operators didn't fully grasp what was happening. The instruments were confusing. Temperatures were rising in unexpected patterns. It wasn't until someone physically looked into the reactor through an inspection port and saw the cherry-red glow of burning fuel cartridges that the reality sank in. The core was on fire. What followed was a desperate, improvised firefighting effort. First, they tried to push the burning fuel cartridges out of the back of the reactor using long metal rods, the same rods normally used for routine fuel handling. This worked for some cartridges, but actually made things worse in places by letting more air reach the flames. Then they tried flooding the reactor with carbon dioxide to starve the fire of oxygen. It wasn't enough. The fire kept burning. And then someone made the call that everyone dreaded. Tom Twohy, the deputy general manager of the plant, made the decision to use water. Putting water on a nuclear reactor fire was terrifying for a very specific reason. If the water hit metal hot enough to decompose it, you could get hydrogen gas, and hydrogen mixed with the air already flowing through the reactor could explode. They would be risking a hydrogen explosion inside a burning nuclear reactor. But the fire wasn't going out any other way, and radioactive contamination was pouring into the sky over the English countryside. So they turned the hoses on. And it worked. Slowly, agonizingly, over the course of about a day, the water quenched the fire. There was no hydrogen explosion, though the risk had been very real. When it was over, pile number 1 was destroyed. The core was a ruined mass of melted and burned fuel, and the reactor would never operate again. Pile number 2 was shut down as a precaution and never restarted either. The immediate health consequences were handled with a measure of quiet British efficiency that, in retrospect, looks a lot like suppression. Milk from farms in a 200-square-mile area around Windscale was collected and dumped for weeks because it was contaminated with iodine-131, a radioactive isotope that concentrates in milk and then in human thyroid glands. The government publicly downplayed the severity of the accident. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, concerned about the political implications, Britain was in the middle of negotiating nuclear cooperation agreements with the United States, personally intervened to tone down the official report. The full, unredacted version of the investigation wasn't released for decades. Estimates of the health impact vary. Some studies suggest the release may have caused on the order of a few hundred additional cancer cases over the following decades among the surrounding population, though the numbers are genuinely uncertain and debated. What's not debated is that Windscale was the worst nuclear accident in British history, and it happened because of a combination of imperfect knowledge, inadequate instrumentation, production pressure from the weapons program, and the fundamental challenge of managing a physical phenomenon, Wigner energy, that was not yet fully understood. And there's one more detail about Windscale that deserves mention, because it's a story about foresight that paid off in ways no one expected. When the Windscale piles were being designed, a physicist named John Cockcroft, the same Cockcroft who won the Nobel Prize for splitting the atom, insisted that large filters be installed at the tops of the exhaust stacks. These were massive steel and concrete structures, and many people at the time thought they were unnecessary and expensive. They were mockingly called Cockcroft's follies. But during the fire, those filters caught a significant fraction of the radioactive particles that would otherwise have gone straight into the atmosphere. Without them, the contamination would have been far, far worse. Cockcroft's follies saved countless people from exposure, and the lesson is one that echoes through every nuclear disaster that follows. The safety features that seem like overkill, the ones that people grumble about because they cost too much and will probably never be needed, those are exactly the ones that matter most when everything else goes wrong. So by the early 1960s, the nuclear world had two serious accidents to study, Windscale and SL-1, and both pointed to the same uncomfortable truth. These machines were powerful, they were useful, and they were dangerous in ways that even the people who designed them didn't always anticipate. But the nuclear industry was growing fast. Dozens of commercial reactors were under construction or in planning stages around the world. In the United States, the Atomic Energy Commission was actively encouraging utilities to build nuclear plants, and a new generation of larger, more powerful reactors was taking shape on drawing boards. Light water reactors, both pressurized water reactors and boiling water reactors, were becoming the dominant commercial designs in America, and they were being scaled up dramatically. The reactors of the mid-1960s were producing hundreds of megawatts, and the ones being planned for the 1970s would push past 1,000. And as the reactors got bigger, the consequences of something going wrong got bigger too. The engineers knew this. They talked about it, they worried about it, and they developed a concept that would become the defining safety question of the next 2 decades, something called a loss of coolant accident, or LOCA. The idea was deceptively simple. What happens if, for whatever reason, a reactor loses the water that keeps its fuel cool? And the answer to that question is terrifying, and it's worth understanding exactly why. In a running reactor, you've got fuel, uranium oxide pellets stacked inside long, thin metal tubes called fuel rods. Those pellets are incredibly hot, not just because of the fission chain reaction, but because of something that makes nuclear reactors uniquely dangerous compared to, say, a coal plant. Even after you shut the reactor down, even after you slam every control rod in and stop the chain reaction completely, those fuel pellets keep generating heat. A lot of heat. This is called decay heat, and it comes from the radioactive byproducts of fission, all those unstable atoms that were created when uranium split apart. They're still decaying, still releasing energy, and there's absolutely nothing you can do to turn that process off. You can't flip a switch, you can't pull a plug. The physics just keeps going. Right after shutdown, the decay heat in a large reactor can be something like 6 or 7% of full power. That might not sound like much, but think about what that means for a 1,000-megawatt reactor. 6% of 1,000 megawatts is 60 megawatts. 60 megawatts of heat pouring into fuel that's no longer being cooled by circulating water. That's enough thermal energy to bring things to a catastrophic state remarkably quickly. Within minutes, the fuel cladding, those metal tubes holding the pellets, can reach temperatures where they start to react chemically with steam, producing hydrogen gas and weakening the metal. Keep going, and the fuel itself begins to melt. And once fuel melts, you've lost your geometry, you've lost your barriers, and you've got a molten radioactive mass that can breach the reactor vessel, hit the concrete containment floor, and potentially release enormous quantities of radioactive material into the environment. So the question the engineers were wrestling with in the 1960s was straightforward in concept, but maddeningly difficult in practice. How do you guarantee that cooling water keeps reaching the fuel no matter what? What if a big pipe breaks? What if a pump fails? What if you lose electrical power? The answer they came up with was something called the Emergency Core Cooling System, or ECCS. The basic idea is that you have backup systems, independent of the normal cooling loop, that can flood the reactor core with water if the primary system fails. Some of these use high-pressure injection pumps. Some use massive tanks of water held under pressure, ready to dump into the core by gravity or gas pressure. The designs varied, but the principle was the same. If you lose your normal coolant, something else kicks in automatically and keeps that fuel covered with water. Here's the thing, though. Nobody had ever actually tested these systems under realistic conditions at full scale. You can do calculations. You can run small-scale experiments. You can build computer models. But in the 1960s, those computer models were primitive by today's standards, and the physics of a large break loss of coolant accident, where a major pipe ruptures and the entire reactor coolant system depressurizes in seconds, involves incredibly complex two-phase flow. That's the engineering term for what happens when you've got a mixture of water and steam churning through pipes, and it behaves in ways that are notoriously hard to predict. Water flashes to steam. Steam pockets block the flow of incoming cooling water. The emergency coolant you're injecting might get swept right back out the break before it ever reaches the fuel. These were real concerns, and some very smart engineers inside the AEC and at the national laboratories were raising alarms. One of the key figures in this story is a man named Robert Gillette, a journalist who in the early 1970s wrote a series of articles for Science magazine that brought these internal debates into public view. But before the public knew anything, the arguments were happening behind closed doors. Engineers at places like Oak Ridge National Laboratory and Idaho National Engineering Laboratory were running scaled-down tests, and some of those tests were producing results that didn't match the safety analyses the reactor vendors were submitting to get their plants licensed. In one particularly alarming series of tests called the semi-scale experiments, conducted at the Idaho facility in the late 1960s and early 1970s, they simulated a loss of coolant accident in a small test loop and found that the emergency cooling water didn't behave the way the models predicted. Instead of flowing down into the core and covering the fuel, the water was being pushed back up and out by the force of steam rushing upward from the hot core. The fuel rods in the test went uncovered. They overheated. Now, these were small-scale tests, and there were legitimate debates about how well they represented what would happen in a full-size reactor. The reactor vendors, companies like Westinghouse and General Electric, argued that the scaling was off, that in a real large reactor, the geometry would be different and the emergency water would reach the core. And they might have been right. The scaling problem in nuclear safety testing is genuinely difficult, but the fact remained that the experimental evidence was, at best, ambiguous, and some of the AEC's own engineers felt that the safety margins were being overstated. This is where the institutional dynamics get really interesting and really troubling. Remember, the AEC had two jobs that were fundamentally in tension: promote nuclear power and regulate nuclear safety. The same organization that was encouraging utilities to build reactors was also supposed to be the tough cop making sure those reactors were safe. And when internal engineers raised concerns about the ECCS, the institutional pressure was enormous. There were billions of dollars of reactor orders at stake. The utilities had committed. The manufacturers had committed. Entire regional economies were being built around planned nuclear plants. Slowing things down, demanding more testing, tightening the safety requirements, all of that threatened the momentum of the entire industry. In 1971 and 1972, the AEC held a series of public hearings on emergency core cooling system effectiveness. These hearings were extraordinary. For the first time, the internal disagreements within the nuclear establishment were aired in something resembling a public forum. Engineers who had been raising concerns internally now had a chance to testify, and some of them did so at considerable professional risk. The hearings dragged on for months. Thousands of pages of testimony were generated, and in the end, the AEC issued interim acceptance criteria for ECCS performance that many of the dissenting engineers felt were still inadequate, too reliant on optimistic computer models, too forgiving of uncertainties. But let's pull back from the bureaucratic drama for a moment and think about what this means in practical terms, because this is the setup for what happened at 3 Mile Island. By the mid-1970s, the United States had dozens of operating commercial nuclear power plants, with more under construction. These were large, complex facilities generating electricity for millions of people. The safety case for every single one of them rested, in part, on the assumption that if a loss of coolant accident occurred, the emergency core cooling systems would work as designed and keep the fuel from melting. That assumption had never been validated at full scale. The small-scale tests had produced mixed results. The computer models were improving, but still contained significant uncertainties. And the regulatory body responsible for ensuring safety was the same organization whose mission included promoting the technology. In 1974, Congress finally addressed the conflict of interest by splitting the AEC into two separate agencies. The promotional function went to what would eventually become the Department of Energy. The regulatory function went to a new independent agency, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or NRC, which began operations in January 1975. This was a genuine structural improvement. The NRC could focus on safety without worrying about whether its decisions were good for the industry's bottom line. But institutional culture doesn't change overnight. Many of the same people who had worked at the AEC simply moved to the NRC. The same assumptions, the same relationships with industry, the same intellectual frameworks carried over. The NRC was better than what came before, but it wasn't a clean break. And then, on March 28, 1979, at 4 o'clock in the morning, a series of pumps stopped working at the 3 Mile Island Nuclear Generating Station near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and everything the nuclear safety community had been arguing about for a decade suddenly became terrifyingly real. 3 Mile Island Unit 2 was a pressurized water reactor built by Babcock and Wilcox, and it had been operating commercially for only about 3 months when the accident began. The initial triggering event was almost mundane. A failure in the secondary cooling system, the non-nuclear side of the plant. The pumps that fed water to the steam generators tripped off. This was not by itself a crisis. The reactor was designed to handle this. Within seconds, the reactor automatically scrammed. The control rods dropped in. The chain reaction stopped. So far, everything was working exactly as intended. But here's where it starts to go wrong, and it goes wrong in a way that's almost painfully human. When the secondary pumps failed, the primary coolant system, the water flowing directly through the reactor core, started heating up because it had nowhere to dump its heat. The pressure in the primary system began to rise. A relief valve on top of the pressurizer, a tall, cylindrical component designed to maintain the right pressure in the primary loop, opened automatically to vent some of that pressure. This was also by design. The valve was supposed to open, release some steam and water to bring the pressure down, and then close again. It opened, the pressure dropped, and the valve was supposed to close. It didn't. The valve stuck open, and this is where a mechanical failure of the simplest possible kind, a valve that should have closed and didn't, combined with a series of human misunderstandings to create the worst nuclear accident in American history. Because the operators in the control room didn't know the valve was stuck open, there was no direct indicator on the control panel that showed the actual position of the valve. There was an indicator that showed whether the electrical signal had been sent to close the valve, and that indicator said yes, the signal had been sent. But the valve itself hadn't moved. It was still open, and reactor coolant, hot, pressurized, radioactive water, was pouring out through it, draining out of the primary system and into a drain tank on the floor of the containment building. So now you have exactly the scenario that everyone had been worrying about. A loss of coolant accident. Not from a big dramatic pipe break, but from a stuck-open valve, quietly bleeding the reactor dry. And the emergency core cooling system did exactly what it was supposed to do. It kicked in and started pumping water into the primary system to replace what was being lost. For a few minutes, the system was working. The backup was doing its job, but the operators didn't understand what was happening. They saw the pressurizer level, the water level in that tall cylindrical component, rising, and they interpreted this as meaning the primary system was too full of water. In reality, the rising level was an illusion caused by the water in the system flashing to steam as the pressure dropped. The system was actually losing water, but the instruments were telling a story that looked like the opposite. And so the operators did something that, in hindsight, was catastrophic. They turned off the emergency core cooling pumps. They manually overrode the safety system that was trying to save the reactor, because they believed, based on their training and their reading of the instruments, that the system had too much water rather than too little. This is the moment that defines 3 Mile Island, and it's worth sitting with for a second, because it tells you something profound about the relationship between humans and complex machines. The operators weren't incompetent. They weren't reckless. They were trained professionals making decisions based on the information available to them, and the information was misleading. The control room at TMI Unit 2 had over 1,000 individual indicators, alarms, and gauges. In the first few minutes of the accident, over 100 alarms went off simultaneously. There was no system to prioritize them, no way to quickly distinguish the critical signals from the noise. The operators were drowning in data and starving for understanding. And while they struggled to figure out what was going on, the reactor core was uncovering. The water level dropped below the top of the fuel rods. The exposed fuel heated up rapidly. Remember that decay heat, relentless and unstoppable. The zirconium cladding on the fuel rods reached temperatures above 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit and began reacting with steam, producing hydrogen gas. About half the core melted. Molten fuel slumped to the bottom of the reactor vessel. For a time, no one on site fully understood how badly the core had been damaged. It would take years of careful analysis, including sending a camera down into the reactor vessel, to piece together the full picture of the destruction inside. The immediate health consequences of 3 Mile Island were, by the standards of what could have happened, remarkably limited. The containment building held. The thick concrete and steel structure that surrounded the reactor vessel did its job, preventing the kind of massive radioactive release that a full breach would have caused. Some radioactive gases, primarily xenon and krypton, were released into the atmosphere, but the doses to the surrounding population were small. Multiple studies over the following decades found no significant increase in cancer rates among people living near the plant. The physical health impact was minimal, but the psychological and political impact was enormous. The accident happened just 12 days after the release of a Hollywood film called The China Syndrome, which depicted a fictional nuclear plant accident and cover-up. The timing was almost unbelievable. Public trust in nuclear power, which had already been eroding through the 1970s, collapsed. Over 100,000 people evacuated the area around Harrisburg, many of them voluntarily, driven by fear and confusion and conflicting information from officials who themselves didn't fully understand what was happening inside the reactor. Governor Richard Thornburgh ordered a precautionary evacuation of pregnant women and preschool children within a 5-mile radius, and the uncertainty about whether a hydrogen bubble inside the reactor vessel might explode kept the nation on edge for days. The aftermath reshaped the American nuclear industry in ways that are still felt today. The NRC launched a comprehensive investigation. The Kemeny Commission, appointed by President Carter, issued a report that was devastating in its conclusions, not about the technology itself, but about the humans and institutions surrounding it. Training was inadequate. Control room design was poor. Communication between the utility, the NRC, and the public was chaotic. The commission found that the fundamental problem was not that a valve stuck open, but that the entire system, the training, the procedures, the instrumentation, the regulatory oversight, had failed to account for the reality of how humans interact with complex machines under stress. And this brings us to a concept that 3 Mile Island essentially forced into existence, at least in the nuclear world: the idea of human factors engineering. Before TMI, reactor safety analysis was overwhelmingly focused on equipment, pipes, valves, pumps, containment structures. The assumption was that if you designed the hardware correctly, the operators would follow procedures and everything would be fine. TMI proved that assumption catastrophically wrong. The operators were part of the system, and the system had to be designed for real human beings, people who get confused, who misread instruments, who make reasonable decisions based on incomplete information, who panic when 100 alarms go off at once. After TMI, control rooms were redesigned, training programs were overhauled. The NRC required every nuclear plant to have a full-scale simulator, an exact replica of the control room where operators could practice responding to emergency scenarios, including scenarios they'd never seen before. The Institute of Nuclear Power Operations, or INPO, was created by the industry itself as a self-policing organization to share best practices and conduct peer reviews. The changes were real and substantive, and they made American nuclear plants meaningfully safer. But here's what's important to understand about 3 Mile Island in the larger story we're following tonight. The accident proved that a core meltdown was possible in a commercial reactor. Not just theoretically possible, but actually possible in a real plant, with real operators, under conditions that were not particularly exotic. A stuck valve, misleading instruments, under-trained operators. That's all it took. And while the containment held at TMI, while the worst-case scenario was averted, the accident raised a question that would haunt the industry for years. What happens when a similar accident occurs in a reactor that doesn't have the same robust containment? What happens when the institutional failures are deeper, the safety culture weaker, the political pressures more extreme? 7 years later, on the other side of the world, in a country where reactor designs prioritized production over safety, and where the very concept of questioning authority was dangerous, a group of engineers at a power plant in northern Ukraine began preparing for a safety test on their number 4 reactor. The test was supposed to demonstrate that the plant could handle a specific emergency scenario, a loss of external electrical power. It had been postponed several times already, and there was pressure to get it done. The night shift crew who would actually run the test had not been fully briefed on the procedures, and the reactor they were working with, an RBMK-1000, that distinctly Soviet design we talked about earlier, the one with the graphite moderator and the pressure tubes, had a characteristic that almost nobody outside a small circle of physicists fully appreciated. At low power levels under certain conditions, the RBMK had a positive void coefficient of reactivity. And that term, positive void coefficient, is one of those phrases that sounds dry and technical, but it describes something genuinely terrifying once you understand what it means. So let's slow down and talk about it, because this single characteristic is at the heart of everything that happened on the night of April 26, 1986. You already know that in a nuclear reactor, you need a moderator to slow down neutrons so they can sustain the chain reaction. In the RBMK, that moderator is graphite, thousands of tons of it, stacked into a massive block with channels bored through it for the fuel assemblies in the cooling water. Now, the cooling water in an RBMK does absorb some neutrons as it passes through those channels. Not a lot, but some. It's not the primary moderator, the graphite handles that job, but the water does have a slight damping effect on the reaction. It nibbles away at a few neutrons that might otherwise go on to split more uranium atoms. So here's what happens if that water starts to boil. When liquid water turns to steam, it becomes much less dense. Those steam bubbles, those voids, are far less effective at absorbing neutrons than the liquid water was, which means more neutrons are now available to sustain fission, which means the reactor power goes up, which means the water gets even hotter, which means more steam, which means even more reactivity. You see where this is going. It's a positive feedback loop. More power creates more voids create more power. In reactor physics, that's what a positive void coefficient means. The formation of steam voids increases reactivity rather than decreasing it. Now contrast that with the pressurized water reactors used in most Western plants. In a PWR, the water serves as both coolant and moderator. If the water boils away or is lost, you lose your moderator, and the chain reaction slows down or stops. The physics work in your favor. The system has a natural tendency to shut itself down when things go wrong. That's a negative void coefficient, and it's one of those inherently safe characteristics that reactor designers in the West considered non-negotiable. The RBMK didn't have that built-in safety net. The graphite was always there, always moderating, regardless of what the water was doing. So when the water boiled, you didn't lose your moderator, you just lost the thing that had been absorbing a few of your neutrons, and the reactor responded by getting more reactive, not less. The designers knew this. They understood the physics perfectly well. But the RBMK had other advantages that Soviet planners cared about. It could be refueled while running. It could be built large and produce a lot of power. It used ordinary water instead of expensive heavy water, and it could produce plutonium for weapons. Those priorities won out, and the positive void coefficient was considered manageable, something that could be controlled through operational procedures and the automatic regulation systems. As long as you operated the reactor correctly within its approved parameters, the positive void coefficient wouldn't be a problem. That's the theory anyway. The practice turned out to be very different. The safety test that was planned for Unit 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was actually a reasonable idea in principle. The scenario was this: if the plant lost external electrical power, the emergency diesel generators would kick in, but they took about 60 to 75 seconds to spin up to full capacity. During that gap, the reactor's cooling pumps would lose power. The test was designed to see whether the residual spinning energy of the plant's own turbine generators, the momentum of those massive turbines as they coasted down, could bridge that gap and keep the coolant pumps running long enough for the diesels to take over. It was an electrical engineering test, really, not a nuclear test, but it had to be done with the reactor running because you needed the turbine spinning under load. The test had been attempted before and hadn't produced satisfactory results. This time, they wanted to get it right. It was originally scheduled for the afternoon of April 25th, when the day shift, the crew most familiar with the test procedure, would be on duty. But the power grid controller in Kiev called and asked them to delay because another power station had gone offline unexpectedly and the grid needed Chernobyl's output. So they kept running at full power through the afternoon and into the evening. By the time the grid controller released them, it was close to midnight. The day shift was long gone. The evening shift was ending. The test would now fall to the night shift, led by a young shift supervisor named Alexander Akimov, with the reactor controlled by senior engineer Leonid Toptonov. These were competent people, but they had not been adequately briefed on the test procedures, and they were about to operate the reactor in a regime it was never meant to inhabit. The plan called for reducing reactor power to somewhere between 700 and 1,000 megawatts thermal for the test. But during the power reduction, Toptunov let the power drop too far. Way too far, down to about 30 megawatts thermal. At that low power, a fission product called xenon 135, which is a powerful neutron absorber, began building up in the fuel. Xenon poisoning, it's called. The xenon was essentially smothering the chain reaction, soaking up neutrons like a sponge. The correct thing to do at that point, the safe thing, would have been to shut down the reactor entirely and wait about 24 hours for the xenon to decay away. That's what the operating procedures called for. But there was pressure to complete the test. It had already been postponed multiple times, and so they made the decision to try to bring the power back up. To fight through the xenon poisoning, they had to withdraw control rods, a lot of control rods. The RBMK 1000 had 211 control rods, and the operating rules specified that a minimum number had to remain inserted at all times to maintain what's called the operating reactivity margin, essentially a buffer of shutdown capability. That minimum was usually around 28 to 30 rods worth of reactivity. As the operators pulled rods to overcome the xenon, the operating reactivity margin dropped far below that minimum. Some analyses suggest it was down to the equivalent of 6 to 8 rods. The reactor was barely controllable. It was like driving a car where the brakes have been almost entirely removed. on a road that slopes downhill. You might be okay as long as nothing surprises you, but you have almost no ability to stop quickly if something goes wrong. And here's where the design of the control rods themselves becomes part of the story, a detail that almost nobody knew was important until it was too late. The RBMK control rods had graphite tips. The bottom section of each rod, the part that entered the reactor channel first when a rod was inserted, was made of graphite, with the neutron-absorbing material, boron carbide, above it. The graphite tip was there for a physics reason related to improving the axial power distribution during normal operations. But it had a dangerous side effect. When a control rod was fully withdrawn and then reinserted, the graphite tip would enter the channel first, displacing water in the lower part of the channel. And since graphite is a better moderator than water, that initial insertion would actually cause a brief spike in reactivity in the lower part of the core before the absorbing section of the rod followed and began shutting things down. Under normal operating conditions, with adequate reactivity margins, this momentary positive insertion effect was small and manageable. But with the reactor in the state it was in that night, low power, deeply xenon poisoned, almost all control rods withdrawn, operating reactivity margin essentially gone, that brief spike could be catastrophic. At 1:23 in the morning on April 26th, the operators began the test. They blocked the emergency core cooling system, disconnected it because they didn't want it to activate during the test and interfere with the measurements. They allowed the turbine to begin coasting down. And as the coolant flow decreased with the slowing pumps, the water in the core began to boil more vigorously. In a reactor with a negative void coefficient, that would have been self-correcting. In the RBMK, it was self-amplifying. Power began to rise. Toptunov or Akimov, the accounts vary on exactly who gave the order, saw the power rising and hit the AZ5 button, the emergency shutdown. Every control rod in the reactor began driving into the core simultaneously, and those graphite tips entered first. In the lower part of the core, where the rods had been almost fully withdrawn, the graphite tips displaced water and added reactivity at exactly the moment when the reactor was already surging out of control due to the positive void coefficient. Instead of shutting down, the reactor power spiked, not by a small amount, not by double or triple. The best estimates suggest the power surged to something like 30,000 megawatts thermal, roughly 100 times the reactor's rated capacity, in a matter of seconds. Some estimates go even higher. What happened next was not a nuclear explosion in the sense of a bomb. It was a steam explosion, or more precisely, two explosions in rapid succession. The fuel heated so rapidly and so intensely that it shattered, and the superheated water flashed to steam with enormous force. The first explosion blew the 2,000-ton upper biological shield, a massive concrete and steel lid, clear off the reactor. The second explosion, which may have been a steam explosion, or possibly a small nuclear excursion, or a hydrogen explosion, the exact mechanism is still debated, blew the building apart. Burning chunks of graphite and reactor fuel were hurled into the night sky and landed on the roofs of the adjacent buildings, including the roof of Unit 3's turbine hall, starting fires. The graphite moderator, all 1,200 tons of it, was now exposed to air and burning. The reactor core was open to the atmosphere, and a plume of radioactive material began rising into the sky. 2 plant workers died almost immediately from the explosions. But the real horror was just beginning. The plant's firefighters responded within minutes, climbing onto the roof of the turbine hall to fight the fires, walking through fields of intensely radioactive debris without any understanding of what they were dealing with. They picked up pieces of graphite with their hands. They stood in spots where the radiation field was so intense that they received lethal doses in minutes. Many of these firefighters, young men, most of them, would be dead within weeks, their bodies destroyed from the inside by acute radiation syndrome. 28 emergency workers and plant staff died of acute radiation exposure in the months following the accident. The total death toll, including long-term cancer deaths, remains debated and politically charged to this day, with estimates ranging from the low thousands to tens of thousands, depending on the methodology and assumptions used. The Soviet government's initial response was denial and suppression, a pattern that should feel familiar by now. The first indication that anything had happened came not from Moscow, but from Sweden, where workers at the Forsmark nuclear power plant, more than 1,000 kilometers away, detected elevated radiation levels on their clothing and initially feared a leak at their own facility. When they determined the contamination was coming from outside, from the east, the questions began. It took the Soviet government more than 36 hours to issue a terse public acknowledgement, and even then, the statement drastically understated the severity. The evacuation of the nearby city of Pripyat, a purpose-built city of nearly 50,000 people, most of them plant workers and their families, located just 3 kilometers from the reactor, didn't begin until 36 hours after the explosion. For a day and a half, children played outside in the spring, sunshine while invisible fallout settled on everything around them. When the evacuation finally came, residents were told to bring documents and enough supplies for 3 days. Most never returned. Pripyat remains an abandoned ghost city to this day, its apartment blocks and schools and amusement park slowly being reclaimed by forest. The effort to contain the disaster was staggering in scale. Helicopter crews flew directly over the burning open reactor core to drop sand, lead, clay, and boron onto the fire, absorbing enormous radiation doses in the process. Miners tunneled beneath the reactor to install a concrete slab, fearing that the molten core material might burn through the basement floor and reach the groundwater. And eventually, over the following months, a massive concrete enclosure, the sarcophagus, was hastily constructed over the ruined reactor to contain the radioactive remains. It was built under desperate conditions by workers who could only spend minutes at a time in the most contaminated areas, and it was never intended to be permanent. Decades later, a much larger structure, the new safe confinement, an enormous arched steel structure, was slid into place over the aging sarcophagus, designed to last at least 100 years. Chernobyl changed everything. If 3 Mile Island had shaken public confidence, Chernobyl shattered it. The accident contaminated vast swaths of Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, and detectable fallout spread across most of Europe. It contributed to the political unraveling of the Soviet Union, as glasnost made it increasingly impossible to hide the scale of the disaster and the decades of institutional dishonesty that had enabled it. It led to the creation of international nuclear safety organizations and conventions. It prompted a fundamental re-examination of reactor design philosophy worldwide. The idea that a reactor could have a positive void coefficient and rely on administrative procedures to keep it safe was now utterly discredited. And yet, even after Chernobyl, even after the world had seen what could happen when a reactor's design flaws combined with human error and institutional failure, the story of nuclear disasters was not over, because there was another scenario that the industry believed it had adequately prepared for. A scenario involving not operator error, not design flaws, but an external event so extreme that it overwhelmed every layer of defense simultaneously. And the place where that scenario played out was a coastal nuclear power station in northeastern Japan, a facility called Fukushima Daiichi, where 6 boiling water reactors sat behind a seawall that had been designed to withstand a tsunami of about 3.5 meters, maybe 5.5, depending on which assessment you look at. The number shifted over the years as different studies were commissioned. But the essential point is this. The seawall was built to handle what the designers considered a credible worst case, based on the historical record available to them at the time. And that decision, that judgment call about how bad things could possibly get, is where the Fukushima story really begins. Not on the day of the disaster, but decades earlier, in the engineering offices where someone drew a line and said, "This is high enough." Let's talk about that for a second, because it gets at something fundamental about how engineers think about natural hazards. You can't design for infinity. You can't build a wall that's infinitely tall or a bridge that's infinitely strong. At some point, you have to choose a design basis, a specific level of threat that your structure is engineered to withstand. And you make that choice based on data. You look at historical records. You study geological evidence. You run probabilistic models. And then you pick a number that represents a level of hazard so unlikely that it's considered acceptable to design against it and not beyond it. The Japanese have a word for this kind of thinking. They talk about the design basis event, just like engineers everywhere do. But Japan's relationship with earthquakes and tsunamis is so ancient and so intimate that you'd think, of all places, they'd get this right. And in many ways, they did. Japan's seismic engineering is among the most sophisticated in the world. Their building codes are extraordinary. The Fukushima Daiichi plant itself was designed to withstand powerful earthquakes, and when the actual earthquake hit on March 11, 2011, a magnitude 9.0, one of the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded anywhere on Earth, the plant's seismic response worked essentially as intended. The reactors that were operating at the time, units 1, 2, and 3, automatically scrammed. The control rods inserted. The nuclear chain reaction stopped. That part of the safety system did exactly what it was supposed to do. But here's the thing, and this is where everything we've talked about before comes back. Remember decay heat? That relentless, unavoidable thermal energy that continues pouring out of spent fuel even after the chain reaction has stopped? The fission products in the core don't care that the control rods are in. They're going to keep decaying, keep releasing heat, and that heat has to be removed. At 3 Mile Island, the problem was that operators turned off the system designed to remove that heat. At Fukushima, the problem was that nature took away the ability to remove it at all. The earthquake was enormous. It was centered offshore, about 130 kilometers east of Sendai, and it ruptured a fault zone stretching roughly 500 kilometers along the seafloor. The shaking was severe enough to knock out the external power grid connections to the Fukushima Daiichi plant. Now, losing off-site power at a nuclear plant is not, by itself, a catastrophe. It's actually a scenario that plants are designed to handle. That's what the emergency diesel generators are for. And at Fukushima, those generators started up. Within seconds of losing grid power, the diesels kicked in and began providing electricity to the cooling systems. Everything was working. The reactors had shut down, the diesels were running, the cooling pumps were circulating water. If the story had ended there, you never would have heard of Fukushima Daiichi. But the story didn't end there, because the earthquake had done something else. It had displaced an almost incomprehensible volume of ocean water, and that water was now moving toward the Japanese coast as a tsunami. Not a 3.5-meter tsunami. Not a 5.5-meter tsunami. The waves that struck the Fukushima Daiichi plant were estimated at roughly 14 to 15 meters high. 3, maybe 4 times taller than what the seawall was designed to stop. Think about what that means. The seawall simply ceased to be relevant. The ocean came over it, around it, through it. Massive volumes of seawater flooded the plant site, pouring into the turbine buildings where the emergency diesel generators were located. And this is one of those details that, in hindsight, makes you want to put your head in your hands. The diesel generators, the backup power that represented the last line of defense for keeping cooling water flowing, were installed in the basements of the turbine buildings. Below grade, in a coastal facility, in a country famous for tsunamis. The water found them almost immediately. Within minutes, the generators were flooded, shorted out, and dead. The electrical switching equipment that connected the generators to the cooling pumps was also flooded. The batteries that provided yet another layer of backup power were, in some units, also submerged. So now, picture the situation. It's the afternoon of March 11th, 2011. 3 reactor cores, each containing tens of tons of uranium fuel, have been successfully shut down, but are still generating enormous amounts of decay heat. And there is no electricity. None. No off-site power, because the earthquake destroyed the grid connections. No diesel generators, because the tsunami drowned them. Limited or no battery power. The operators at Fukushima Daiichi were in what's called a station blackout, a total loss of all AC electrical power, which is one of the most feared scenarios in nuclear safety analysis. And they were dealing with it not at 1 reactor, but at 3 simultaneously, while also managing the spent fuel pools at all 6 units, while the surrounding area was devastated by the tsunami, while roads were destroyed, while communications were disrupted, while aftershocks kept coming. The plant superintendent was a man named Masao Yoshida. And whatever you think about the institutional failures that led to Fukushima, Yoshida's personal conduct during the crisis was remarkable. He was making life and death decisions with almost no information, no power, and no good options. The instrument panels in the control rooms were dark. The operators couldn't tell what the water levels in the reactors were. They couldn't tell what the pressures were. They were, in a very real sense, flying blind. Here's what was happening inside those reactor vessels, even though no one could see it. Without cooling water circulation, the water surrounding the fuel began to heat up. It started to boil. As it boiled, the water level dropped, gradually exposing the tops of the fuel rods. Fuel rods are clad in an alloy called zircaloy, a zirconium-based metal chosen because it's mostly transparent to neutrons and has good mechanical properties under normal operating conditions. But zircaloy has a dangerous characteristic at high temperatures. When it gets hot enough, somewhere above about 1,200 degrees Celsius, it reacts with steam in an exothermic oxidation reaction. The zirconium strips the oxygen from the water molecules, releasing hydrogen gas and generating additional heat, which accelerates the process. So you get this terrible feedback loop. The fuel heats up because there's no cooling water. The hot zircaloy reacts with steam to produce hydrogen and more heat, which heats the fuel further, which causes more reaction. And meanwhile, hydrogen gas is accumulating inside the reactor vessel and, eventually, leaking into the reactor building. In Unit 1, this process advanced the fastest. Within roughly 24 hours of the tsunami, the fuel in Unit 1 had likely melted through the bottom of the reactor pressure vessel and was pooling on the concrete floor of the primary containment. A full meltdown. Units 2 and 3 followed over the next few days, each experiencing severe core damage. And then came the explosions. Not nuclear explosions, hydrogen explosions. The hydrogen gas that had been generated by the zircaloy steam reaction accumulated in the upper portions of the reactor buildings, mixed with air, and when it reached the right concentration, it detonated. The Unit 1 reactor building exploded on March 12th, blowing off the roof and upper walls in a dramatic blast that was captured on television cameras and broadcast around the world. Unit 3 exploded on March 14th, even more violently. Unit 4, which hadn't even been operating at the time of the earthquake, its core had been completely offloaded to the spent fuel pool for maintenance, also suffered a hydrogen explosion, apparently from hydrogen that had migrated through shared ventilation ducts from Unit 3. The images were shocking. The buildings looked like they'd been hit by bombs. Concrete walls shattered, steel frameworks twisted, debris everywhere. Meanwhile, Yoshida and his team were trying desperately to get water, any water, into the reactors. With no pumps working, they initially tried using a system designed for fire emergencies, injecting water from fire trucks through improvised connections. When fresh water ran out, Yoshida made the decision to inject seawater directly into the reactor vessels. This was an extraordinary call, because pumping seawater into a reactor essentially destroys it. The salt corrodes everything, and the reactor will never operate again. TEPCO headquarters in Tokyo reportedly hesitated, reluctant to give up on the possibility of salvaging the reactors. Yoshida ignored them. He ordered the seawater injection and later claimed with a certain grim humor that he had simply pretended not to hear the order to stop. The radioactive releases from Fukushima were significant. Volatile fission products, iodine 131, cesium 134, cesium 137, escaped through damaged containment structures, through deliberate venting operations that were necessary to relieve dangerous pressure buildup, and through the hydrogen explosions themselves. The Japanese government ordered evacuations and expanding radii around the plant, first 3 kilometers, then 10, then 20. Approximately 154,000 people were displaced. The contamination plume drifted northwest, carried by the winds, depositing radioactive cesium across a band of agricultural land and small towns in Fukushima Prefecture. But here's what's important to understand about the health consequences, and this is where Fukushima diverges sharply from Chernobyl. The radiation doses received by the general public were, for the most part, relatively low. The evacuations, while traumatic and disruptive, were largely effective in limiting exposure. Extensive monitoring of the evacuated populations has been ongoing for years, and as of the most recent major studies, no measurable increase in radiation-related cancers has been detected among the public. The World Health Organization's assessment concluded that the predicted lifetime cancer risks were small. The greatest health impacts of Fukushima were not from radiation itself, but from the evacuation, the stress, the disruption, the loss of community, the deaths of elderly and hospitalized patients who were moved under chaotic conditions. Over 2,000 people are estimated to have died from evacuation-related causes. That's a painful irony worth sitting with. Among the plant workers, radiation exposures were higher, and a handful received doses that may elevate their long-term cancer risk. But even among the workers, the doses were generally below the levels associated with acute radiation sickness. No workers died from acute radiation exposure at Fukushima. Compare that to Chernobyl, where 28 people died of acute radiation syndrome within months. So what went wrong? from an engineering perspective. The reactors themselves survived the earthquake. The automatic shutdown systems worked. The fundamental nuclear physics wasn't the problem. The problem was that the defense-in-depth strategy, that layered approach to safety, had a common vulnerability. Every layer depended, ultimately, on electrical power, and every source of electrical power was vulnerable to the same external event. The grid connections, the diesel generators, the batteries, they could all be taken out by a single sufficiently large tsunami. This is what engineers call a common cause failure, and it's one of the most dangerous things that can happen in any complex system. You think you have redundancy, you think you have backup after backup, but if all your backups share the same weakness, then one event can sweep them all away at once. And the deeper question, the one that's harder to answer, is why the tsunami risk was underestimated in the first place. Because there was evidence, historical evidence, that tsunamis larger than the design bases had struck that coastline before. In 869 AD, the Jogan earthquake and tsunami devastated the Sendai Plain, and geological surveys had found tsunami deposits extending kilometers inland. In 2008, a study within TEPCO itself had estimated that a tsunami as high as 15.7 meters was possible at the Fukushima site. But that finding was not acted upon. The seawall was not raised. The diesel generators were not moved to higher ground. The reasons for this inaction are complex. They involve regulatory complacency, the cozy relationship between TEPCO and the Japanese nuclear regulatory bodies, a cultural reluctance to challenge established safety assessments, and perhaps a simple, very human tendency to believe that the worst case is something that happens to other people, in other places. The Japanese Diet's Independent Investigation Commission, which published its findings in 2012, called the Fukushima disaster profoundly man-made. Not in the sense that the earthquake and tsunami were man-made, obviously, but in the sense that the vulnerability of the plant to exactly this kind of event was the result of human decisions, human assumptions, and human failures of imagination. The Commission found that both TEPCO and the regulators had failed to implement safety measures that were already recognized as necessary, and that a culture of deference and institutional complacency had allowed known risks to go unaddressed for years. After Fukushima, the global nuclear industry went through another round of soul-searching, much as it had after 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl. Japan shut down its entire fleet of nuclear reactors for safety reviews, all 54 of them. Some have since restarted, slowly and under much stricter regulations, but many remain offline to this day. Germany accelerated its decision to phase out nuclear power entirely. Other countries recommitted to nuclear energy but imposed new requirements for beyond design basis event planning, for passive safety systems that don't require electrical power, for what's sometimes called stress testing against extreme external hazards. And this brings us to something that connects all three of these major accidents, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, Fukushima, in a way that goes deeper than the specific technical failures. Because in each case, the technology itself was not the fundamental problem. The reactors at TMI, at Chernobyl, at Fukushima were all products of their respective engineering cultures, and each one failed in ways that reflected the blind spots of those cultures. The American system at TMI had good hardware, but hadn't adequately considered how human operators would interact with it under stress. The Soviet system at Chernobyl had a fundamental design flaw that was known but tolerated because the institutional culture couldn't acknowledge it. The Japanese system at Fukushima had layers of defense that all shared the same hidden vulnerability, because the regulatory culture couldn't bring itself to challenge the assumptions of the operators. And that pattern, the way institutional culture shapes engineering risk, is something that shows up not just in nuclear power, but across every domain where complex, high-consequence systems are built and operated. It shows up in aviation, in chemical processing, in space exploration. There's a whole field of study built around this idea, pioneered in part by a sociologist named Charles Perrow, who published a book in 1984 called Normal Accidents. Perrow's argument was provocative and, to many engineers, deeply uncomfortable. He suggested that in systems that are both complex and tightly coupled, meaning that the components interact in unexpected ways, and that failures can cascade rapidly from one subsystem to another, accidents are not aberrations. They're inevitable. They're normal. Not in the sense that they happen every day, but in the sense that the system's own complexity guarantees that, sooner or later, some combination of failures will occur that the designers never anticipated, and the tight coupling will ensure that those failures propagate faster than any human operator can respond. Now, not everyone agrees with Perrow. Many engineers and safety researchers argue that his framework is too fatalistic, that good design, good training, and good organizational culture can reduce risk to extraordinarily low levels. And the track record of nuclear power, taken as a whole, actually supports that argument. There are over 400 commercial reactors operating worldwide, and in more than 60 years of commercial nuclear power, there have been exactly 3 major accidents. The safety record, measured in deaths per unit of energy produced, is actually better than almost any other energy source, including wind, solar, and natural gas, and far better than coal. Coal alone is estimated to cause hundreds of thousands of premature deaths every year through air pollution, particulate matter, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, all the byproducts of combustion that settle into lungs and accumulate over decades. And that's not even counting the miners who die in collapses and explosions, or the long-term effects of coal ash and heavy metal contamination in water supplies. Natural gas is cleaner, but it still produces carbon dioxide, and methane leaks from pipelines and wellheads contribute significantly to climate change. Hydroelectric power is wonderful when it works, but dam failures, and there have been some catastrophic ones, can kill tens of thousands of people in a single event. The Banqiao Dam failure in China in 1975 killed an estimated 170,000 people, making it by far the deadliest energy-related disaster in history, though it's rarely discussed in the West. Even wind and solar, which are genuinely very safe, carry small but non-zero risks in manufacturing, installation, and maintenance. People fall off roofs installing solar panels. Technicians are killed servicing wind turbines. The numbers are tiny per unit of energy, but they're not zero. So when you put nuclear power in that context, 3 major accidents in 60-plus years, with a combined death toll that, even using the most pessimistic estimates for long-term cancer effects from Chernobyl, is in the low thousands. The picture looks very different from the one most people carry in their heads. The fear of nuclear power is viscerally real, and it's understandable. Radiation is invisible. The word itself carries the weight of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The accidents that do happen are dramatic and terrifying in a way that the slow, grinding toll of air pollution simply isn't. Nobody makes a movie about particulate matter. But the numbers tell a different story, and it's worth sitting with that for a moment. Because the gap between perceived risk and actual risk is itself one of the most important lessons in the history of nuclear engineering. Here's the thing, though. Saying that nuclear power has a good safety record overall doesn't mean the industry gets to rest on that claim. Each of those three major accidents revealed something genuinely important about the limits of the engineering and the institutions behind it. And each one drove real changes, not just in reactor design, but in how the entire industry thinks about safety, regulation, and the relationship between technology and the humans who operate it. So let's talk about what actually changed, because this is where the story gets genuinely hopeful in a way that I think matters. After 3 Mile Island, the big shift was in how operators were trained and how control rooms were designed. Remember, the core problem at TMI wasn't really the stuck valve. That was the initiating event, but stuck valves happen. The real problem was that the operators couldn't figure out what was happening to their reactor. The instruments were confusing, the alarms were overwhelming, and the mental model they'd been trained on didn't match the actual situation. So the industry invested heavily in what's called human factors engineering, redesigning control rooms so that information is presented more intuitively, so that the most critical readings are the most prominent, so that alarm systems prioritize and filter rather than just screaming everything at once. Simulators became mandatory. Every licensed operator now spends weeks each year training on full-scale replicas of their specific plant's control room, running through scenario after scenario, including scenarios designed to be confusing and ambiguous, because that's what real emergencies are like. The creation of INPO, the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations, gave the industry a mechanism for self-policing that was genuinely rigorous. INPO evaluations are detailed, they're taken seriously, and a bad INPO rating can effectively end a plant's ability to get insurance, which means it can't operate. That's real accountability, and it was born directly from the failures at TMI. After Chernobyl, the changes were different in character because the accident itself was different. The RBMK's positive void coefficient, that fundamental design flaw where losing coolant made the reaction speed up instead of slowing down, was something that Western reactor designs had deliberately avoided from the beginning. So in one sense, Chernobyl confirmed what Western engineers had always believed, that the RBMK was an inherently risky design. But the deeper lesson was about safety culture, about what happens when a political system makes it impossible to openly discuss the weaknesses of its own technology. The Soviet nuclear establishment knew about the RBMK's quirks. Some engineers had raised concerns, but the institutional incentives all pointed toward silence, toward meeting production targets, toward not embarrassing the state. After Chernobyl, even the Soviet Union couldn't maintain that posture. The remaining RBMK reactors were modified. The graphite tips on the control rods were replaced. The void coefficient was reduced through changes to the fuel enrichment, and new operating procedures were imposed. More broadly, the international nuclear community created mechanisms for sharing safety information across borders in ways that hadn't existed before. The World Association of Nuclear Operators, WANO, was founded in 1989, specifically because Chernobyl demonstrated that a nuclear accident anywhere is a nuclear accident everywhere. Radiation doesn't respect borders, and neither should safety practices. And after Fukushima, the reckoning was about something engineers call common cause failure, and about the assumptions that underlie what's known as the design basis of a plant. Every nuclear plant is designed to withstand certain external events, earthquakes of a certain magnitude, floods of a certain height, tornadoes of a certain wind speed. These are the design basis events, and the plant is engineered to handle them with comfortable margins. But Fukushima showed what happens when the actual event exceeds the design basis, and more importantly, when the same event takes out multiple safety systems simultaneously, because they all share the same vulnerability. The diesel generators were all in the basement. The seawater pumps were all at the same elevation. The assumption that the tsunami wouldn't exceed a certain height was baked into every layer of defense. So after Fukushima, regulators worldwide conducted what they called stress tests, systematic reviews asking for each plant, what happens if we lose all AC power? What happens if we lose the ultimate heat sink? What happens if both happen at the same time? And the answers drove real physical changes. Plants installed additional portable generators and pumps, stored at higher elevations, in hardened buildings, dispersed across the site, so that no single event could take them all out. New procedures were written for what's called FLEX, diverse and flexible coping strategies that give operators tools and time to manage beyond design basis events, even when the normal safety systems are unavailable. But here's where the story takes a genuinely interesting turn, because all of these post-accident improvements were essentially retrofits, fixes applied to existing reactor designs that were conceived in the 1960s and 1970s. The fundamental architecture of most operating reactors today is, at its core, 50 or 60 years old. And for decades now, engineers have been asking a different question. What if you designed a reactor from scratch, knowing everything we now know about what can go wrong? What if, instead of adding safety systems on top of safety systems, each one requiring power and pumps and valves and human operators to activate them, you designed a reactor where the laws of physics themselves would shut the reactor down and remove the decay heat, even if every operator walked away and every pump lost power and every electrical system failed? This is the idea behind what's called passive safety, and it's one of the most elegant concepts in modern nuclear engineering. Think about what it means. In a conventional reactor, safety depends on active systems, pumps that must pump, valves that must open, diesel generators that must start, operators who must make correct decisions under pressure. Every one of those is a potential point of failure. Passive safety means designing the reactor so that the natural forces, gravity, convection, the thermal expansion of materials, the fundamental physics of neutron behavior, do the work of keeping the reactor safe without any human intervention and without any external power source. Now, this isn't entirely new as a concept. Even the earliest reactor designers understood some of these principles. The negative temperature coefficient in a light water reactor, the fact that as the water heats up, it becomes less effective as a moderator, which naturally slows the chain reaction. That's a passive safety feature, and it's been built into Western reactors from the beginning. But the new generation of designs takes this much further. Consider, for example, the AP1000, designed by Westinghouse. It's a pressurized water reactor, so in many ways it's a descendant of the same basic design that Rickover championed for the Nautilus back in the 1950s. But its safety systems are radically different. Above the reactor containment building, there's an enormous tank of water, about 3 million liters, held up by gravity. If the reactor loses coolant pressure, if the normal safety systems fail, that water drains down over the containment vessel by gravity alone. No pumps, no power, no operator action required. The water flows down, cools the containment shell, and the heat is transferred to the atmosphere through natural convection and evaporation. The system can keep the reactor in a safe state for at least 72 hours with no human intervention whatsoever, and essentially indefinitely as long as the external water tank is periodically refilled, which is a simple operation that doesn't require any complex systems. Or consider the designs that go even further. Small modular reactors, or SMRs, some of which use fundamentally different coolants and fuels. There are designs that use molten salt as both the fuel and the coolant, which means that if the reactor overheats, the salt expands and the reaction naturally slows. And if things get really bad, a freeze plug at the bottom of the reactor vessel, literally a plug of frozen salt kept solid by active cooling, melts, and the entire fuel drains by gravity into a passively cooled holding tank where it's physically impossible to sustain a chain reaction. The geometry won't allow it. The safety mechanism is the melting of a plug. That's it. No valves to open, no signals to send, no decisions to make. Physics handles it. There are high-temperature gas-cooled reactors that use fuel embedded in tiny spheres of ceramic and graphite. Each fuel particle is essentially its own containment vessel, capable of withstanding temperatures far beyond anything the reactor could produce, even in a worst-case scenario. These are sometimes called pebble bed reactors because the fuel takes the form of tennis ball-sized graphite spheres, each containing thousands of these tiny coated fuel particles. The whole design is engineered so that as temperature rises, the nuclear reaction slows down. The negative temperature coefficient is so strong that a meltdown in the traditional sense is physically impossible. The fuel can't get hot enough to breach its own containment, because the hotter it gets, the less reactive it becomes. It's a self-limiting system. And this is really the philosophical heart of where nuclear engineering has arrived after 60 years of hard lessons. The goal is no longer just to add more backup systems, more redundancy, more layers of defense and depth, though all of that still matters. The goal is to design reactors where the worst-case scenario is inherently manageable, where the physics of the system itself prevents catastrophe, where you don't need heroes like Yoshida making desperate decisions at 3 a.m. to prevent a disaster from becoming a catastrophe. You design the reactor so that even if every human fails and every machine breaks, the outcome is still acceptable. Now, whether these new designs will fulfill their promise is still an open question. Some of them are being built right now. The first AP-1000 units came online in China at the Sanmen and Haiyang plants in 2018, and in the United States at the Vauxhall plant in Georgia in 2023, though the Vauxhall project was famously over budget and years behind schedule, which tells you something about the gap between elegant engineering concepts and the messy reality of actually constructing these things in the real world. The economics of nuclear power remain genuinely challenging, and that's a story that intertwines with the engineering story in ways that are sometimes uncomfortable to talk about. Because here's the thing, nuclear reactors, from a pure engineering standpoint, have arguably never been better. The designs are safer, the materials are more understood, the operational culture is more disciplined. And yet the industry, at least in much of the Western world, has been in a kind of slow decline for decades. Not because the technology failed, but because the economics got brutal. Let's talk about why. Building a nuclear power plant is one of the most capital-intensive things humans do. You're constructing an enormously complex facility with hundreds of thousands of individual components, miles of piping, redundant safety systems layered on top of redundant safety systems, all built to standards that are, rightly, far more stringent than almost any other construction project on Earth. Every weld has to be inspected. Every concrete pour has to meet nuclear-grade specifications. The supply chain for reactor-grade components is specialized and thin. There are only a handful of foundries in the world that can forge a reactor pressure vessel, for instance, and the whole thing takes years to build, sometimes a decade or more. And during all those years of construction, you're paying interest on the billions of dollars you borrowed to start the project, and you're not generating a single kilowatt-hour of electricity to sell. Compare that to a natural gas plant, which you can build in 2 or 3 years for a fraction of the cost, or a wind farm that goes up even faster. The electricity market doesn't care how elegant your reactor physics are. It cares about the price per megawatt hour. And when natural gas got cheap, really cheap, especially in the United States after the shale revolution took off around 2008, 2009, nuclear plants found themselves competing against an energy source that was abundant, flexible, and inexpensive. Some existing nuclear plants that were already built and paid for couldn't compete on operating costs alone. That's remarkable when you think about it. The fuel cost for a nuclear plant is tiny compared to a gas plant. Uranium is energy dense enough that fuel is maybe 5 to 10% of the total cost of nuclear electricity. But the fixed costs, the maintenance, the staffing, nuclear plants employ far more people per megawatt than gas plants. And the regulatory compliance costs all add up. And this is where the story of Vogtle becomes so instructive. The Vogtle expansion in Georgia, Units 3 and 4, those AP1000 reactors we were just talking about, was supposed to be the American nuclear renaissance. When construction was approved in 2012, the estimated cost was around $14 billion for the 2 units. By the time Unit 3 finally started commercial operation in 2023 and Unit 4 in 2024, the total cost had ballooned to around $35 billion, more than double the original estimate. The construction took roughly 7 years longer than planned. The original contractor, Westinghouse, actually went bankrupt during the project in 2017. The company that designed the AP1000, one of the most storied names in nuclear engineering history, filed for Chapter 11, largely because of cost overruns on Vogtle and a similar project in South Carolina called VC Summer, which was abandoned entirely after spending $9 billion with nothing to show for it. Now you might be thinking, well, if the design is so good, why was it so hard to build? And the answer is layered. Part of it was that the United States hadn't built a new nuclear plant in decades. The last one to come online before Vogtle was Watts Bar Unit 2 in Tennessee in 2016, and before that, Watts Bar Unit 1 in 1996. The country had essentially lost its nuclear construction workforce. The skilled labor, the project management expertise, the supply chains, all of it had atrophied. When you haven't built something in 30 years, you've lost the institutional knowledge of how to do it efficiently. Workers on the Vogtle site were in some cases learning as they went. Design changes were still being finalized while concrete was being poured. There were problems with the modular construction approach that was supposed to make the AP1000 cheaper. Large modules were fabricated off-site and shipped in, but they didn't always fit together the way they were supposed to. Quality control issues led to rework. Rework led to delays. Delays led to cost overruns, and cost overruns led to more delays. It's a vicious cycle that's plagued nuclear construction projects around the world, and this isn't just an American problem. In France, the Flamanville 3 reactor, an EPR design, which is the European equivalent of a next-generation pressurized water reactor, was originally supposed to cost about 3 billion euros and be finished by 2012. As of its eventual fuel loading in 2024, the cost had reached somewhere around 13 billion euros, 12 years late. In Finland, the Olkiluoto 3 EPR had a similar story. Started in 2005, originally budgeted at 3 billion euros, finally connected to the grid in 2023 at a cost of around 11 billion. These are patterns, not anomalies. But here's what's really interesting, and this is where the story takes a turn that a lot of people don't expect. While Western nuclear construction has struggled enormously, other countries have been building reactors on time and on budget, or at least much closer to it. South Korea, in particular, built a series of APR-1400 reactors, their own advanced pressurized water reactor design, with impressive efficiency. The Shinkory units in South Korea were built in 5 to 6 years at costs that were a fraction of what Western projects were running, and South Korea exported that capability. The Baraka nuclear plant in the United Arab Emirates, 4 APR-1400 units, built by the Korea Electric Power Corporation, came in roughly on schedule and at a cost of about $24 billion for all 4 units combined. That's $6 billion per reactor, which is expensive by any standard, but it's a world away from Vodal's numbers. China has been even more aggressive. The Chinese have built dozens of reactors over the past 2 decades, including those AP-1000 units at Sanmen and Haiyang, plus their own indigenous designs like the Hualong 1. And they've generally done it faster and cheaper than anyone in the West. The Hualong 1 units at Fuqing, for example, were built in about 5 years each. Part of this is lower labor costs, sure. But a bigger part is continuity. When you're building reactor after reactor after reactor, you maintain the workforce. You refine the processes. You learn from each project and apply those lessons to the next one. It's the same principle that made France's original nuclear build-out in the 1970s and 80s so successful. France committed to a standardized design, the 3-loop and 4-loop pressurized water reactors based on Westinghouse technology, and built 56 of them in about 15 years. That's an astonishing pace. And they did it affordably because they were building the same thing over and over, getting better and faster each time. So the lesson isn't that nuclear power plants are inherently too expensive to build. The lesson is that nuclear construction requires sustained commitment, standardized designs, continuous workforce development, and a regulatory framework that is rigorous but also predictable. When you have all of those things, nuclear power can be built economically. When you don't, when you're starting from scratch after a 30-year gap with a first-of-a-kind design in a regulatory environment that's still evolving, costs spiral. And this matters enormously right now because the conversation around nuclear power has shifted in ways that would have seemed almost unimaginable 10 years ago. Climate change has reframed the entire energy debate. If you're serious about decarbonizing the electricity grid, and increasingly about decarbonizing industrial heat, hydrogen production, desalination, all these energy-intensive processes, you need sources of energy that are both low carbon and reliable. Wind and solar are wonderful, and they've gotten astonishingly cheap, but they're intermittent. The sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. You need something to fill in the gaps, something that can run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, regardless of weather. Natural gas can do that, but it produces carbon dioxide. Hydropower can do it, but most of the good sites are already developed. Nuclear can do it, and it does it with essentially zero carbon emissions during operation. This realization has led to a remarkable shift in public and political attitudes. Countries that were phasing out nuclear power have started reconsidering. Japan, which shut down its entire reactor fleet after Fukushima, has been gradually restarting units. As of 2024, about a dozen Japanese reactors are back online, with more in the pipeline. Germany, which completed its nuclear phase-out in April 2023, shutting down its last 3 reactors, has faced criticism for replacing that clean electricity, largely with natural gas and coal, and there's an ongoing debate about whether that decision was wise. Belgium extended the life of some of its reactors. The United Kingdom has committed to new nuclear construction at Hinkley Point C and Sizewell C. Even the United States, where nuclear seemed to be in terminal decline, has seen a remarkable turnaround. Existing plants that were scheduled for early retirement have been given life extensions, and there's growing interest in small modular reactors, or SMRs, which promise to address some of the construction cost problems by building smaller, factory-fabricated units that can be assembled on site. Small modular reactors are fascinating because they represent a fundamentally different approach to the economics problem. Instead of building one enormous reactor, a gigawatt-class behemoth that takes a decade to construct, you build smaller units, maybe 50 to 300 megawatts each, in a factory setting where you can control quality and costs much more tightly. Then you ship the modules to the site and assemble them. The idea is to turn nuclear construction from a bespoke, one-of-a-kind mega-project into something more like manufacturing. Windscale, a company based in Oregon, received the first-ever design certification from the NRC for a small modular reactor in 2023, though their first planned project at the Idaho National Laboratory was actually canceled later that year due to rising cost estimates, which, again, tells you that the gap between concept and reality remains stubbornly wide. But the momentum is real. Microsoft, Google, Amazon, major tech companies desperate for clean, reliable power to run their data centers, have all announced deals involving nuclear energy. The demand for electricity is growing faster than almost anyone predicted, driven by artificial intelligence, electric vehicles, and the broader electrification of everything. And nuclear is one of the very few energy sources that can deliver large amounts of carbon-free, always-on power. So here we are, more than 7 decades after Enrico Fermi's team achieved the first sustained nuclear chain reaction under the bleachers of a squash court at the University of Chicago, and the fundamental tension at the heart of nuclear power hasn't really changed. It's a technology of extraordinary power and extraordinary consequence. The engineering has gotten remarkably good. Passive safety systems, negative temperature coefficients, defense in depth that would have seemed almost miraculous to the engineers who built those early reactors at Windscale or the SL1. But the human systems around the technology, the economics, the politics, the public trust, the regulatory frameworks, the construction management, those remain messy, complicated, and profoundly human. And maybe that's the most important lesson buried in all these stories we've been wandering through tonight. Because when you line up every major nuclear accident, from Windscale in 1957 to Fukushima in 2011, the reactors themselves are almost never the villain. The villain, if you want to call it that, is us. It's people. People making decisions under pressure, people cutting corners to meet deadlines, people ignoring warnings because the warnings were inconvenient, people building institutions that were supposed to provide oversight but instead provided cover. The technology does what the technology does. Atoms don't have agendas. Neutrons don't get tired or distracted or politically motivated. But the people who design, build, operate, and regulate nuclear systems, they do all of those things every single day. Think about what we've actually seen over the course of this story. At Windscale, you had operators deliberately trying to heat up a reactor to release stored energy from a phenomenon they barely understood, using procedures that were essentially improvised in a facility that had been built in a rush to give Britain a nuclear deterrent. The graphite caught fire. The filters that saved the surrounding population from a far worse disaster, the Cockcroft filters, were almost left off the design because they were considered an unnecessary expense. One man's insistence, against considerable institutional resistance, prevented a catastrophe from becoming something much worse. That's not an engineering story. That's a story about a single person's judgment prevailing against bureaucratic momentum. At SL1, you had a tiny experimental reactor in the Idaho desert, operated by a small crew with inadequate training, and, it appears, serious personal troubles. One person manually withdrew a control rod far beyond its safe limit, and in 4 milliseconds the reactor went prompt critical. 3 men died. The investigation revealed problems that had been visible for months: maintenance issues, procedural sloppiness, low morale. The signals were there. Nobody acted on them decisively enough. At 3 Mile Island, the equipment failure that started everything was relatively minor. A stuck-open relief valve. The reactor could have handled it. The emergency core cooling system kicked in and was doing exactly what it was designed to do. But the operators, confused by misleading instrument readings and trained in a culture that feared a solid pressurizer more than a dry core, manually overrode the very system that was saving them. They turned off the safety pumps. The core melted. And the reason the instrument readings were misleading, the reason the control room was poorly designed, the reason the operators had the wrong mental model of what was happening inside their reactor. All of that traced back to an industry and a regulatory structure that hadn't taken human factors seriously. The machines worked. The people-machine interface failed. And then Chernobyl. Where do you even start with Chernobyl? A reactor design with a known dangerous flaw, the positive void coefficient at low power, that was kept partially secret from the very operators who needed to understand it. A safety test that had been postponed and handed off to a night shift that hadn't been properly briefed. A deputy chief engineer who pushed his operators past multiple safety limits because the test needed to get done. An emergency shutdown system that, because of a design quirk in the control rods, actually caused a momentary power spike instead of an immediate shutdown. Every layer of that disaster was a human decision. The decision to build RBMK reactors without full containment structures. The decision not to share safety-critical information openly. The decision to continue the test when the reactor was in a dangerous, xenon-poisoned state. The decision to press AZ-5. Even the delayed evacuation of Pripyat, 36 hours of people going about their lives while graphite burned on the roof of a shattered reactor building, was a human decision, driven by political fear of admitting what had happened. Fukushima. The tsunami was a natural disaster, but the vulnerability of the Daiichi plant to that tsunami was entirely man-made. TEPCO and Japan's regulators had evidence, historical records, geological studies, their own internal analyses, suggesting that tsunami heights at the site could exceed the plant's design basis. They didn't act on it. The seawalls weren't raised. The backup generators weren't moved to higher ground or waterproofed. The regulatory body that was supposed to force these changes was captured by the industry it regulated, staffed by people who rotated between the regulator and the utilities, embedded in a culture where challenging the safety narrative was career suicide. When the tsunami hit and the station lost all power, the operators inside those dark, irradiated buildings performed acts of genuine heroism. Masao Yoshida's decision to inject seawater against corporate orders probably prevented an even worse outcome. But they were fighting a battle that never should have been necessary. So here's the pattern. Here's what connects all of these events across decades and continents and vastly different political systems. In every case, the engineering knowledge existed to prevent the disaster, or at least to dramatically reduce its severity. The physics was understood. The failure modes were known, or at least knowable. What failed was the human system. The organizational culture, the communication, the regulatory independence, the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths and spend money on invisible risks that might never materialize. James Reason, a psychologist who studied accidents across many industries, developed what's sometimes called the Swiss cheese model. Imagine multiple slices of Swiss cheese stacked together, each slice representing a layer of defense: design safety margins, operating procedures, training, regulatory oversight, emergency response. Each slice has holes in it because no single defense is perfect. An accident happens when the holes in every slice line up, allowing a hazard to pass through every layer of protection simultaneously. What's powerful about this model is that it shows you that catastrophic accidents are almost never caused by a single failure. They're caused by the alignment of multiple failures, each of which might be individually tolerable. A stuck valve is tolerable if the operators respond correctly. Operators responding incorrectly is tolerable if the instruments give them accurate information. Misleading instruments are tolerable if the training program has prepared them for exactly this scenario. But when the valve sticks and the instruments mislead and the training was inadequate, when all the holes line up, you get a core melt. And the thing about those holes is that most of them are carved by human decisions made long before the day of the accident. The decision about how much to spend on operator training, the decision about whether to install a redundant sensor, the decision about how honestly to communicate known risks, the decision about whether to delay a maintenance outage because production targets are pressing. These are mundane, everyday choices. Nobody making them thinks they're setting up a catastrophe. But accumulated over time, across an organization, they determine whether those Swiss cheese holes are small and randomly scattered, or large and dangerously aligned. This is what makes nuclear safety, and really, the safety of any high-consequence technology, so deeply, irreducibly human. You can design the most elegant passive safety system in the world, a reactor that shuts itself down by the laws of physics alone, that drains its own emergency coolant by gravity, that can't melt down even if every operator walks away. And those designs are real. They exist. We talked about them. A P1000, molten salt concepts with freeze plugs, pebble bed reactors with ceramic fuel that can withstand extraordinary temperatures. The engineering is genuinely brilliant. But that reactor still has to be built by a construction workforce, managed by a project team, financed by investors or governments, sited through a political process, licensed by a regulator, operated by a utility, and maintained for decades. Every one of those steps involves people making judgments, and the quality of those judgments depends on culture, incentives, institutions, and leadership, things that are far harder to engineer than a pressure vessel or a heat exchanger. Maybe that's why the story of nuclear power resonates so deeply, even for people who will never set foot inside a reactor building, because it's really a story about how we handle power, not just electrical power, but the power of knowledge, the power of technology, the power to make decisions that affect millions of lives. Every major nuclear accident forced a reckoning, not just with reactor design, but with how we organize ourselves. After 3 Mile Island, the American nuclear industry created INPO and fundamentally changed how it thought about human performance and organizational culture. After Chernobyl, the international community created WANO and began sharing operating experience across borders that had been closed by Cold War secrecy. After Fukushima, countries around the world conducted stress tests, reassessed their regulatory independence, and deployed flex equipment, portable backup systems that don't depend on any fixed infrastructure. Each disaster made the system safer. Each disaster revealed blind spots that in hindsight seem almost obvious. And each disaster cost something that can never be fully recovered. Lives lost, communities displaced, trust broken. The question going forward isn't really whether nuclear technology can be made safe. It can. The engineering track record, honestly assessed, shows a technology that has become remarkably safer with each generation. The question is whether we, collectively as societies, can sustain the institutional discipline, the regulatory independence, the cultural honesty, and the long-term commitment that nuclear power demands. Because nuclear doesn't forgive complacency. It doesn't forgive corner-cutting. It doesn't forgive the slow, invisible erosion of safety culture that happens when nothing has gone wrong for a long time, and people start to wonder why they're spending so much money on precautions against events that seem increasingly theoretical. The engineers call this normalization of deviance, the gradual acceptance of anomalies and shortcuts as normal, simply because they haven't yet caused a visible problem. Diane Vaughan coined the term studying the Challenger shuttle disaster, but it applies to every industry where catastrophic failure is rare but devastating. And so tonight, as you're lying there, maybe drifting in and out, maybe catching every word, or maybe just letting the sound of this wash over you, I want to leave you with something simple. The story of nuclear disasters is not, ultimately, a story about atoms or neutrons or steam pressures or containment domes, though all of those things matter enormously. It's a story about attention, about whether we pay attention to the small warnings before they become large emergencies, about whether we build institutions that reward honesty over convenience, about whether we take seriously the things we cannot see, the radiation, the risk, the slow accumulation of compromises that can, on one terrible day, align in exactly the wrong way. The good news, and there is good news, is that we've gotten better at this. Measurably, demonstrably better. The global fleet of nuclear reactors operates today at levels of safety and reliability that would have astonished the pioneers of the 1950s. The lessons paid for so dearly at Windscale, at 3 Mile Island, at Chernobyl, at Fukushima. Those lessons are embedded now in codes and standards and training programs and organizational cultures around the world. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but meaningfully. The people who work in nuclear power today carry those stories with them. They know the names. They know what went wrong and why. And maybe that's enough to hold on to as you drift off. The knowledge that the most powerful technology humans have ever harnessed is watched over by people who remember what happens when you stop paying attention. That every alarm, every procedure, every redundant safety system exists because someone, somewhere, learned the hard way why it was needed. And that the quiet, unglamorous, everyday work of maintaining safety, checking the instruments, following the procedures, questioning the assumptions, speaking up when something doesn't look right, that work is, in its own way, one of the most important things human beings do. It's not dramatic. It doesn't make headlines. But it's the reason the lights stay on, and the water stays clean, and the world keeps turning, one careful day at a time. So rest easy. The people who understand these stories are still telling them, still learning from them, still standing watch. And that, more than any reactor design or safety system, is what keeps us safe. Good night.